Welcome. Thank you all for coming. We're excited to have Joel here. If you don't know who he is, he has a BA in linguistics from Amherst and a PhD in cognition and communication from U Chicago. He applied this interest in how we understand and use speech as a telecommunications engineer at AT&T and Verizon. He's now retired and devotes his time to community building activities, serving on the board of the Weston Arts and Innovation Center and the Weston Forest and Trail Association, for example. So a couple of Zoom housekeeping notes. First, as I said, we're recording this session for broadcast on Waycam, and hopefully they'll post it on YouTube as well. That's our local cable access channel here in Wayland. So you may see your tiny video picture on TV unless you turn off your video. I'm actually going to change my screen to presenter view, and then that will actually get rid of your, I think it'll get rid of you on the video, on the recording. So Joel will be presenting with slides and stopping occasionally for questions. I recommend you switch your view to speaker view and also select view side by side under the view options. And that way you'll see the slides and Joel's face right next to it. I'll put this in the chat also. And finally, for the majority of the event, I don't know if we're going to have as big an issue with this crowd, but you might want to mute your microphone unless you have a question or a comment, but it is also nice to hear your laughter. And feel free to type in any questions into the chat at any time. So I think that's it. Take it away, Joel.
Thank you for that too. And I just got overly excited. So yes, chat, please use the chat, post questions. I'm not looking at the chat, but Courtney said she would. And or just interrupt if ever I'm saying anything, there's something unclear or I say something wrong or whatever. Feel free to. Okay, and also another housekeeping item. I know you had set this up for an hour and 45 minutes. I think an hour is as much as any of us can stand on Zoom. So after that time, I'm just gonna wrap it up wherever we are, and then anybody who wants to hang out and has any other questions, that's fine. Okay, The Tempest, just to put it in its historical perspective, first performed in 1611. It's sort of a famous play because it was Shakespeare's last solo, and one he wrote himself. There's some controversy about that, but scholars feel pretty confident that it was. And oddly enough, in the first folio, which is 1623, I think 7 years after he died, it's the first, even though it was the last one he wrote. And it's sort of interesting to me, too, that the first theater, actual theater, a building for the theater, was 1576. It was only 35 years before The Tempest. That is, theaters hadn't been around a long time before this play. And then so I was doing a little research about how that compares with movies. And the first movie theater in the United States was Plattsville, New York in 1905. 35 years after that, we had Gone with the Wind, we had Mr. Chips, I guess, and a number of other blockbuster movies. So it's sort of similar. 35 years of movie development, all of a sudden we're up to Gone with the Wind. 35 years of a theater in London, and we're up to The Tempest. And of course, Shakespeare had been working for some 20 years beforehand. Okay, rather than talking anymore, I'm gonna jump into, I'm gonna have to move the window here a little bit. I'm going to jump right in to the play itself. And we're going to look at a couple of scenes, a couple of sections. This is all Act 1, Scene 1, the famous Tempest itself. So just to read through this, hey, my hearts, this is a bosun. It's not boat swan, which I thought is bosun. Hey, my hearts, cheery, cheerily, my hearts, yar, yar, take to the topsail, tend to the master's whistle. Good bosun, have care, where's the master? I pray now keep down below. Where's the master, bosun? Do you not hear him? You mar our labor, keep your cabins. Do you assist the storm? Nay, good, be patient. When the sea is, hence, what care these roars for the name of kings? To cabins, silence, trouble us not. Good, yet remember whom you has aboard. None that I love more than myself. You are a counselor. If you can command these elements to silence and work the peace of the present, we will not hand a rope more. Use your authority if you cannot. Give thanks you have lived so long and make yourself ready to your cabin for the mischief of the hour, if it so hap. Cheerily, good hearts, out of the way, I say. I have great comfort from this fellow. Methinks he has no drowning mark upon him. His complexion is perfect gallows. Stand fast, good fate, to this hanging. Make the rope of his destiny our cable. For our own doth little advantage. If he be not born to be hanged, our case is miserable. Down with the topmast, yar, lower, lower, bring her try with the main course. A plague upon this howling. They are louder than the weather of our office. Yet again, do you hear? Shall we give o'er and drown? Have you a mind to sink? A pox on your throat, you bawling, blasphemous, incharitable dog. Work you then, hang, cur, hang, you whoreson, insolent noisemaker. We are less afraid to be drowned than thou art. So, if you're like many people, you have trouble with Shakespeare. I certainly do. And so the subplot, the sub-theme in this short talk is going to be what does it really mean to fully understand a play, to enjoy it? You know, do we enjoy Shakespeare? And also, what did the groundlings, what did the people who attended the plays understand and enjoy at that time? So it's sort of an interesting phenomenon to me too, that because we're speakers of English, we see Shakespeare in the original language. I at least have never seen a production that uses modern English to it. So we read or we watch a performance that's done in English that's 400 years old. If you go to a play that is, say, by one of the French playwrights like Molière, Racine, or whatever, it's done in a translation, because unless you know French and you see it in the original. So we see those plays done in a modern translation. Of course, there are many translations. There's not one. Unless, as I said, any of you on the call right now is fluent in French and would read it in 16th century or French of the 1600s. By the way, you don't see my window, my videos, Courtney, right? You just see the slides?
No, we see your face as well.
Okay, good.
I do, at least.
Good that you don't see the...
Yeah.
Okay, so just the basics of the characters in the Tempest. I'm not going to spend it. Really isn't a talk about the play per se, but about the language in it. Prospero is our central character. He's got by far most of the lines and the major speeches. He has been washed ashore upon this island some 10 years earlier. Because Antonio, his brother, his despicable brother, has banished him, actually sent him out in a leaky boat with his daughter Miranda to die, with the help of Alonso, who was the king of Naples. Prospero was the king of Milan. And they are the central characters. Ferdinand is the young, handsome son of Alonso, the king of Naples. Miranda is the young, beautiful daughter of Prospero. You can guess what's going to happen there. We have Gonzalo, who is the advisor to Alonso. He's going to play a role here. We got some comic characters, Stefano and Trinculo. The blue are all people who were on the boat, sailing from someplace in Africa to someplace in Italy and get caught in this storm and then lost upon this island. Ariel and Caliban are two spirits who live, well, Caliban is an earthy creature, half monster, who lives on this island with Prospero and Miranda. No one else lives on this island. Ariel is sort of a spirit of the air, of the winds. So just to reinforce this a little bit, there are four groups. There's on the island, Prospero, Miranda, Ariel, Caliban are the sort of residents of the island. Then there's one group wandering around the island, Antonio, Alonso, Sebastian, Gonzalo. And then Ferdinand is all alone, lost on the island, but he meets up with Prospero and Miranda. And then finally, Stefano, Trinculo are wandering around the island too. So you have these four different groups that are wandering around the island. They'll all come together at the end. And the very highest sort of plot line here is, it turns out that that Prospero is a magician, can control the spirits, controls the Tempest, and creates this storm so that all these characters end up on his island. And he's there to seek some sort of revenge, at least at the beginning. And there are these lost parties. Ariel is the spirit. Ariel is helping to keep them moving and keep them confused. scene, Act 3, you have Ferdinand and Miranda declare their love for another, Caliban, Stefano, Trinculo plot to kill Prospero, and there's this mysterious royal banquet that appears and disappears. Act 4 is a tough one. It's the mass, the three goddesses performing for Ferdinand and Miranda. Say more about that later. And then Act 5, everybody comes together and there's resolution. And unlike many other plays, everybody doesn't end up dead on the floor. Okay, so let's go back to that scene and I'll talk a little bit about why is Shakespeare difficult. Oops, somehow I went up 2 slides. Let me go back. First of all, you may wonder who's a bosun, and then why is he saying cheerily, cheerily? And what does yar, yar mean? When I underline things, there are particular issues with that text. When he says blow till that burst thy wind, what is that about? And when Gonzola says, nay, good, be patient, what is he talking about? Why should he be good? Well, there's different reasons that the language of Shakespeare is difficult. First of all, there's the cultural references to botanical items, to titles, in this case to bosun. There's also archaic terms like yar, which meant quick. Again, cultural references of all the parts of a boat, which someone in 16th century England probably knew. Archaic expressions, and forms of address, like good was goodman, which is an address for someone beneath you, a commoner or whatever, and that's what he's saying. He's talking to the bosun saying, be patient, goodman. So those are some of the examples why that section would be good. And some of these archaic terms of address can trip us up. Good could refer to goodman, good fellow, good women. Wench is a difficult one. Wench has a very different meaning today. It could be used affectionately. It was sort of like lass. In fact, Prospero calls Miranda at one point my wench. And so it can be used affectionately. Nuncle, again, an affectionate term for an uncle or any older man, Sarah. So you have a lot of these particular terms of address that are archaic or no longer familiar to us, but it's not an infinite number. And can be learned. Then the next section, when the sea is, hence, what care these roars for the name of king, to cabin silence, etc. One of the interesting things is you and your, and thou and thee, and how they're used. This is a constant issue in all of Shakespeare's plays, one of the most difficult for modern speakers of English. I'm assuming people on this call may be familiar with this. Many people think thou, thee, thine, because it sounds formal and ancient, is somehow a higher form of address of somebody who is above you or you're being more formal or whatever. It's actually the opposite. Thou, thee, thy, thine, we're all informal versions of you and your. And you, your, yours, yourself is a more formal. And you would say to somebody who's your superior, you, your, etc., and your inferior, thou, thee. Well, this occurs and is used many other times, times throughout here. In that scene we just read, the mariners are using you to the nobles that are on board, and the nobles are using thy and thee. Pretty expected. In other cases, it's sort of interesting, like Prospero and Ario thou each other, even though it's clearly a master-servant relationship. So I think Shakespeare is clearly emphasizing the point that there's sort of a friendly, warm relationship between Prospero and Ariel, although in many sense, it seems like she should be youing him and he should be thouing her, if it's a her. It's not clear what Ariel is. So there's a gradual evolution of the single form you that is happening this time, as indeed I hear in French and Italian. Romance languages are going away from this sort of upper you and lower you to a single form of you. In the earlier plays, you see it more often.
Interrupt for a second with a question.
Sure.
What about people of the same social status?
Well, it's interesting because I know that there's some cases where there's a contract to move to the thou. I know in Romeo and Juliet, some of the younger characters to the elders use you and then may switch to thou at some point, showing that they've reached that level of familiarity with it. But I think, you know, it must have made life a lot more complicated to think, do I you, do I thou you? You know, at what time can you, when you thou?
So I also have a comment and an observation, perhaps. In the Book of Common Prayer, which was written in the first edition was written in the late 1500s, almost all of the prayers that are addressed from the people to God Almighty use the familiar, the thou and the thee and the thy. So it's also about a certain connection of familiarity, but also a connection of love and protection.
Yes, thank you. That's very good. And that's one of the, 1611 is the King James Bible. You thou God, which is sort of interesting. You're right. It's a sign of affection, of closeness. It almost seemed to me like a little bit of an exception, but it is used so consistently. I mean, you capitalize thou, God, but you thou him. It's a complicated, and sometimes it seemed hard for me to follow in, especially a Trinculo and Stefano starts to thou others, like I'm superior to you, but then he switches back. I think sometimes it might be used simply because Shakespeare thought it sounded better in that particular line or in that particular context. A few other things in that first section of, the words we heard: methink, hath, stand fact, doth. These generally aren't too tough. Methinks, no one says methinks or stand fast or etc., except if they're trying to sound like Shakespeare, right? It's a good way to, pretend like you're sounding like 16th century, say methinks. There's some like, what we'll talk a lot more about is false friends, like office, when he says they are louder than the weather or our office. Office also meant your efforts, your work, your struggles. So when he's saying these roars are louder than the noise the people are making are louder than the weather or our efforts. The bosun is saying here, the nobles are making too much noise. And what do you hear is a archaic expression of what are you doing? Why are you here? What do you, and why were often interchanged. So some of these little things, doth, hath, is of course throughout Shakespeare, another way to sound like Shakespeare if you want to. And it's just changing at this point. Looked up a little data. Before 1600s, 1/5 of the texts they have use S endings and 4/5 use the TH ending. This is in the third person singular. So we would say he does, they said he doth. Or we would say he has, but they said he hath. But after the 1600s, it starts to reverse. It actually was coming from the north, from Scotland, where they were using the S instead of the TH. Very common words like hath and saith were the last ones to change, and that's often the case, is the very familiar words. And even the Tempest, it's all mixed up. 34 hases, 21 hast, and 26 hath. Often younger characters and women tend to use the more modern forms. In fact, this is interesting that women, not just in the plays, but in England, women were using the S form first. And then gradually men started to use the S form and drop the TH form. And even as the play progresses, as you look at Shakespeare's plays, the TH form starts to go away and being replaced by the S form. Okay. But that's usually, I don't think, it sounds old-fashioned, but is usually not any sort of problem with comprehension. There's a lot of, like methinks, there's a lot of very common archaic forms in early modern English. And I call archaics if we don't say methinks or hence or brave. As I was saying, Courtney was brave. It meant splendid or good or fine. And it's used throughout the play. These are very common words you see in every act and every play. and they can possibly trip up some people. When, like, I pray thee, mark me, was I ask you, listen to me. Beseech is a sort of stronger form of pray. I pray thee or prithee thee. Prithee thee was a combination of pray and thee. So you see these common terms. I think I have another slide. I can't see my next slide. But there are a set of these that occur very frequently. And if you read Shakespeare at all, sooner or later, these will either burn in or become familiar to you. I think it's so interesting, the hither, thither, whither, and all the various forms of that, which today we just have here and there. Hence, thence, whence, again, they occur throughout, and we just have fewer forms that they had more ability. Like, for example, yawn, I think is a good one. We have here and there. We don't have a yawn or a yonder. And a yawn or yonder, we sort of miss it. We should bring it back. It was for something that was over there, but you could still see it. So you had to be able to see it in the distance to say yonder, yonder tree or yonder house. If you couldn't see it, then it was there, in general, as I understand it. But we've lost that. But again, hark, used throughout, meaning listen. We do have many of these forms still in a certain residual cases, like hark the herald angels sing, listen to the angels. But in general, these have disappeared from common speech. Presently, I still hear they use in England, as I understand. Any English speakers here from England? But I guess they use that presently. We don't use that in this side of the Atlantic to mean immediately. Severally is used throughout, also with a stage direction, means separately. So anyway, a lot of these soft appears constantly, meaning wait, stay put, not quiet. Now there's some, Elizabethans love to insult each other. There's a lot of insults in Shakespeare, which we'll talk about soon, but they were also very polite. So if you please, there's any number of ways a character say, please you, by your patience, by your pardon, by your leave, by your favor. Again, prithee, I'm sorry or pardon me, cry your mercy, God save the mark, God bless the mark. That was apparently had to do with some people in illnesses and that had diseases or marks on their birthmarks, things like that. And God save the mark was to say, I'm sorry, pardon me, or etc. Okay, I did say I'd talk about insults. They do insult each other a lot, and understanding those to some degree may be of interest. A pox on your throat, plagues and pox. Pox, by the way, was a syphilis, and it was also frequently called the Spanish pox or the French pox. It came in from the New World and was just a terrible disease. Of course, there was no penicillin or anything like that. But I think it's sort of interesting that they typically called it back then Spanish pox or French pox to say it was somebody else's disease brought into England here. It's not our disease. And again, it sort of sounds a little familiar to me. Cur was a wild dog. Whoreson, the son of a whore. There were some minor ones or milder ones, forsooth, by my troth, again, pox, by Apollo. It was inappropriate to use directly Christ or Mother Mary, but there was various ways to hide it. One of which is like through a lot of the plays they used by Jupiter, by Juno. So you could sort of bring in a Roman god's name and an oath, but not so much a Christian. And so they had various ways of hiding that. Zounds, bloody, by the rod, or rude, I guess, by the cross of Christ. And there are many others. If you go and look for Shakespeare insults, you'll find these one. I think some of the problems with, again, understanding a translation is some of these are stronger than others. To us, they're all archaic, so they have this sort of same value. It's just like today in English, we have a lot of swear words, and some are really nastier than others, and some are pretty mild. So having a character say, you whoreson. Is that terrible, or is that just, you know, common everyday language? I don't know, and you'd have to look at the whole corpus. There are any number of great ones. King Lear is just full of them. I like eater of broken meats. That was leftover meats that you leave for the animals. You eat the bones that we give to the dogs. Okay, so some good news about trying to understand Shakespeare is that almost every, if you get the Oxford or the Royal Shakespeare Society books, they modernize the spelling. And they do it in most cases, you know, like U's go to V's and V's go to U's, the sense of dropping the final E in a lot of words that we don't have the final E in it. But why they don't do it all the time, I don't know. And I have some that were not the spelling was not corrected to a modern English, and here a lot where they are corrected, not corrected, they're all changed, translated into modern spellings. If you see the original folio stuff, it is very hard to get through because it's older spellings. The same word supposedly, but older spellings. As is well known, a lot of this was the typesetters would typeset things according to what they spoke or their dialect, and it's a sign too of how people pronounced things differently over time. But the modern editions tend to clean that up. But again, a couple of cases, I don't know why. Showen was a plural form of shoes, and sometimes you'll see that. And unpossible, unfortunate. Another thing we're sort of fortunate about is a grammar. Even though words have changed, grammar has generally stayed the same. Here's a couple of cases here, and I'm gonna, your attention on Prosperos here. Both my girl, by foul play, as thou sayest, we were heaves thence, but blessedly halp hither. Halp, I don't know if anybody has ever come across that. It's a past tense of help. And it's gone away. We don't have it anymore, but it was very common. In fact, that's what's usually used instead of help. And Miranda responding by, I think this is another false friend, to think, oh, the teen that I have turned you to. When I first read that, I think, oh, I'm sorry, I'm 15 now and I'm a terrible teen and I've been a big problem to you. Teen is a false friend, meaning that today it has a different meaning than it did then, which was trouble. I'm not going through all these examples. You have the deck. If you want to, you can look through them. Well, there was a bunch of past tense forms, as you can see in the left, sulp, halp, hild, chopped, that we don't have anymore. And some that they had, oddly enough, they had a sort of traditional or standard catched, dig, showed. Well, we have an irregular. Now, this is our use of past tense is continues to be a little confusing. For example, do you say hung or hanged? And swept or swept or sweeped. I've heard both. So, you know, we still have this in some verbs, the irregular and irregular can be used either way. And in fact, in Shakespeare's time, things were changing, and sometimes he may use one form of the past tense and sometimes the other. You wonder if he wanted that extra syllable in there, sometimes he used the ED form. Syntax, as I was saying, is generally pretty easy. I just have one example here. There are many, like neither nor was used differently. But here, it's called a progressive. We say I try, I cook. We also say I am trying, I am cooking. Sorry, I didn't put the ing there. I am cooking, or the past progressive, I was trying, I was cooking. So they have different meanings. We use it. If we say I cook Italian food, that it means something slightly different than I am cooking Italian food. So if you ask me, what am I doing? Or what do I cook? I say, I cook Italian food. Well, maybe not right now, but I like to cook Italian food, as opposed to I am cooking Italian food right now. Well, they didn't have that progressive use of ing. So it's, you can't really tell in that sense. And usually it doesn't matter. They didn't care. Prospero to Miranda, dost thou attend me? Are you listening to me? We would probably translate that. And she might say, yeah, generally I tend to, but right now I'm distracted. But no, there's only one form of that. But other than that, it's amazing. By 1600, the syntax had largely settled down to what we're familiar with some changes. Okay, so that was just a taste of some of the ways that Shakespeare can be different. Archaic words and expression, we're going to talk more about those, which you just don't see anymore. False friends, words that have changed their meaning. It's the same word, same spelling even perhaps, but has a different meaning. Even words that have the same meaning slightly, but I'll show you some connotation changes. And there's other reasons, like, as I said, biblical, classical references we're not familiar with. We talked about pronoun forms, thee, thou, that we're not familiar with. So the big question here is, what did the average playgoer of 1600 understand? And how is that different than what we understand of a Shakespeare play? And does it matter? And do we need to understand more in order to enjoy more? So we're only a third of the way through, but I'm going to take a little break at this point before we go into more depth and ask if there's any particular questions people have. Anything in the chat?
Nothing
Courtney?
in the chat,
Okay.
no.
So imagine this is an image of the Globe Theater. It could hold apparently 1,000 people. There were no curtains. You can sort of see on the left side there. It was open. There weren't a lot of set pieces. Scenery and staging and all that. So if someone was a king, they put on a crown, you know, that sort of thing. I don't think they had a lot of money for costumes, etc. But I want to make a point here that, as I said, The Tempest comes at the end of Shakespeare's career in 1611. It was the first of Shakespeare's plays to be produced in the Blackfriars Theater, which was apparently, it doesn't exist anymore, but was a big step up. It was much more expensive. You could go to the Globe for a penny. The Blackfriars was 5 pennies, I think, was the minimum ticket. But they, for the first time, had special effects, and they had big racks that could lower scenes, and people could fly up in the air. And it seems a little bit like Shakespeare might have written The Tempest, and especially some of the scenes like the storm scene and the disappearing dinner scene, etc., in a way to exercise the capabilities of this new theater. They said, hey, you know, we got all this whiz-bang technology. It must have been like the, the computer-generated effects of their day. So can you give us something that's really going to show this thing off and wow people? And the storm scene was a wow scene, I'm quite sure. And people commented about the harpies and the dinner scene appearing and vanishing in thin air. It's probably a trapdoor, although we don't know how they did it. One of the reasons I think it's sort of difficult is while you saw those people attending the Globe Theater 2 slides back, you know, we mostly recognize them. They ate the same foods. They wore roughly the same clothing. I mean, they had pants and dresses. They looked different, but they had hats on and all that. And so we think, oh, well, the language they spoke was the same as we spoke. But it was similar, but I think there was more of a difference of what they spoke. Fortunately, if you go back another 200 years, you get to Chaucer, 1400. And if anybody's tried reading Chaucer, but I find it a lot more difficult. And in fact, I really can't understand. I think we generally read it in translation, unless you're an English major. And then you go back to 900, and you get to Beowulf, and you really have to have special training to read that. So the language has evolved, but also to make the point that England was speaking French from 1066 for 400 years, 1066 Norman Conquest to 1417, which is the first use of English in a royal proclamation. It was French and Latin before then. So in a sense, it's only 200 years that the English language has been used, and it was considered an inferior language for most of that time. It's sort of like James Madison or Monroe saying, hey, we're not going to speak Latin anymore, we're going to speak English. It's not that long ago, 200 years. But rapidly, William Caxton starts printing in English. 1476, and that's considered the beginning of early modern English. That's often the landmark they use, mid-1400s, as when they transition from Middle English to modern English. And then we have no dictionaries really until 1755, which is why the language won't stay put. It's only the French had dictionaries in the academy way before the English did, and they could say, this is the way you spell something, this is the way you pronounce something. One example I heard once somebody said was that in English, right, R-I-G-H-T, they have found 75 different spellings for R-I-G-H-T, right, in the corpus. In Latin, there was rectus, and there was one way. There's only one way to spell right, and it was the only way you ever see it spelled. So no wonder you had to use the lingua franca of Latin or French, which were stabilized instead of English. Here's a view of Beowulf, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, famous when that April in his shore suit. I've never been able to read it, but it's fun to hear it in the original. Then 1550, now this is just 50 years before Shakespeare. It starts to look a lot more familiar, but still rather difficult. This is the first known comedy in English. So make the point that words are continuing to change today. It hasn't stopped, of course. It just is changing more slowly because we have TVs, we have universities, we have dictionaries, etc. But a few examples. In 1927, the FCC issued various rules and regulations, and they talked about general interest stations and propaganda stations. Companies had propaganda departments. Propaganda just meant persuasion. It wasn't a sort of negative term as it was after World War II. And in fact, many words just changed their meaning after World War II because of World War II, like dictator, fascist, Aryan, swastika, etc. Or if you look at our words like imbecile, moron, retarded, which all started as sort of neutral or words that were invented to try to refer to a special population, now they all have very negative meaning. I came across John Adams. It's sad men make the best politicians. You wonder, what's he talking about? Why sad men? Sad, as it did in 1600, meant serious. Grave, it also had a secondary meaning, but he clearly meant here that, or maybe he was playing on the word, I know, that serious, grave men make the best politicians.
Joel?
Yeah?
Just a comment on this thing quickly that I remember reading somewhere, I think it was Senator Hayakawa, the linguist from Hawaii, in the 60s, sort of a theory that part of the Cold War problem was that to Americans, compromise meant you negotiate and you get to a common ground, whereas to Russians, compromise meant you compromise your principles.
Yes, interesting. So, I haven't heard that one. Yeah. Yeah, and that's why you wonder how many wars could be started on just misunderstanding or misuse of words, like the famous "we will bury you." And it will continue, you know, wicked and cool and all that stuff. It often happens with slang. It often happens with the sort of secondary populations bring new words into the language, but it's changing slower. Okay, I wanted to, and doing a time check, I see that I said we have a little bit more talking about a couple of aspects of the play of Tempest that may make things a little harder for us. And one of the interesting ones is humor. A lot of people talk about this. Is the humor just completely lost on us where we can't really understand anymore? This is seen from Stefano, comes across a famous four-legged monster. What's happened is Caliban is a storm's coming, and so he hides under his big cloak, his gabardine, and on the ground he hears the voices of these devils coming, which are Trinculo and Stefano. So he hides under there. So Trinculo comes, and the storm is coming, so he hides under this gabardine too. So now you have both Caliban, the monster, so-called, or the and then the Trinculo under it. So Stefano, also drunk, he comes up upon them. Maybe I should have Trinculo read this passage.
Actually, they're not drunk yet. Stefano has had a bit.
Yeah,
but
Stefano,
Stefano has had some. Trinculo hasn't had any, and they're both going to get a lot drunker later on.
Yes, you're right. Yep. Poor Caliban, who's never had alcohol, right?
Right.
So Stefano comes upon this four-legged monster covered by the gabardine and says, "Doth thy other mouth call me? Mercy, mercy, this is a devil and no monster." I'm going to move that. "I will leave him. I have no long spoon." And Trinculo says, "Stephano, if that..."
"Stephano, if thou beest Stephano, touch me and speak to me, for I am Trinculo. Be not afeard, thy good friend Trinculo."
"If thou beest Trinculo, come forth. I'll pull thee by the lesser legs, if any be Trinculo's legs. These they are. Thou art very Trinculo indeed. How camest thou to be the siege of this mooncalf? Can he vent Trinculos?"
I can't see the, oh yes. "I took it to be killed with a thunderstroke. But art thou not drowned, Stephano? I hope thou art not drowned. Is the storm overblown? I hid me under the dead mooncalf's gabardine for fear of the storm. And art thou living, Stephano? Oh, Stephano, 2 Neapolitans escaped?"
Great. I would have enjoyed that production. I think you should do it.
Can
we find somebody to say?
The people at the reading were wonderful.
Yeah. Wow. And yeah, very good. And this is a very funny scene, but it takes a little work, I think, to understand the humor. And let me go back to talk about this. I forget if I have more information, but "I have no long spoon." This was an expression that Stephano says here, that only have dinner with the devil if you have a long spoon. And it's an expression that's no longer familiar to us. But the down at the last line is, "How camest thou to be the siege of this mooncalf?" Well, what's siege mean? Siege was what we would call shit, I guess. And a mooncalf was the monster born under the some phase of the moon. And can he vent was to defecate. So he's saying, how came thou to be the excrement of this mooncalf? Can he actually expel Trinculos? Okay, and later on, shortly, they're getting progressively drunker. They start to drink a lot from the Stephano's bag of, what is it, sack?
Yeah, he came ashore on a whole barrel of sack.
Yep. So Stephano says, "Come, swear to that. Kiss the book. I will furnish it anon with new contents. Swear."
By this good
Take it away.
This is a very shallow monster. I have feared of him, a very weak monster. The man in the moon, a most poor, credulous monster. Oh, well drawn, monster, in good sooth.
So my guess, Annie, is you would have the props, you would use the expressions, the physical, to try to bring out the humor and make people understand what's happening, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
And
that line, that when he refers to the man on the moon, he's calling back to earlier in the scene, a few lines earlier. Stephano has told Caliban that he's the man on the moon. And so I'm reading this as oh, come on, I can't believe you used that line on this poor slob.
Yeah, yeah. And Trinculo's...
And then he turns and he sees Caliban taking a long pull on the bottle, and he's saying, you know, he's drawing a long swallow. Oh, well drawn, well drunk.
Yeah, yep. So it's this sort of this back and forth between Stephano, Trinculo, and Caliban as they get a little bit drunker. They are clearly the comic relief. And I can imagine the groundlings in 1611 just rolling around when they hear stuff like this on stage. It must have been why they paid their penny. Well, if it was in the Blackfriars, it was more than a penny. Okay, I'm going to go quickly over a few of these. If some of the archaic forms that may make things a little bit difficult for us or we trip on. Kit, do we still have you there? He may be on mute or off.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Are you, would you be amenable to reading this little section from no, I'm sorry. This is Miranda speaking. Never mind. Right. You're coming up next.
Okay.
She's by that sea mounting to the welkin's cheek. I had no idea, and I'm sure most normal people wouldn't have any idea. And down at the bottom, the frotting souls within her of the ship. You know, it's nice poetry here, but welkin was sky, and fraught was a ship's freight at the time. And so she's talking here about mounting to the heavens the sea mounting to the heaven dashes the fire out, and frotting souls, the sort of human cargo in this boat that is sinking. And a lot of these archaic expressions. Ague occurs throughout. In fact, there's a character in, what is it, Twelfth Night? Shakespeare uses that. It's just fever, shakes, moraine, wheezin, paunch, troll the catch, etc. There's a lot of these, and sometimes expressions. We steal by line and level. This is a carpenter's line and level, so it means exact measurements. He's saying we steal properly, you know, by crossing my bindings are P's and Q's, we might say today. Again, expressions that are lost on us. There's no way you would know this. Okay, neologism. And I want to jump to the famous scenes at the end to talk about. So we're going to go skip forward to the end. Neologisms, I think, are a problem because these are words that are common or we understand, but were not common to the people who heard the plays. In fact, they may have been invented words. So how do you handle that? That sort of freshness that you get when you never heard this word before. So Kit, you want to read this one?
Know thus far forth, by accident most strange, bountiful fortune, now my dear lady, hath mine enemies brought to this shore. And by my prescience I find my zenith doth depend upon a most auspicious star, whose influence, if now I court not but omit, my fortunes will ever after droop.
Beautiful. Auspicious was a Shakespeare invention, probably. There's always a lot of discussion about this, but the first uses of it are in his plays. This is one of the first uses the OED attributes to. Why he felt he needed the new word here, I'm not sure, but auspicious isn't a new word to us anymore. But will it ever droop? Droop dates back to the 1300s at least. It dates back probably to Old English. So for us hearing this today, how would we know that auspicious was a fresh new word and droop was a very old word? We wouldn't. So but I don't know what one can do about that in trying to understand. I think it would be sort of interesting if various texts would identify what words were new to the people at the time or what words Shakespeare invented. You probably heard a lot about how many words Shakespeare's invented, but the more they look into it, they say, no, they found some document that it was being used in the previous 10, 20 years. So Shakespeare was good at picking up new words, and auspicious may be one like that. There are so many of these. In fact, here they're listed. They tend, oddly enough, to be often Caliban or some of the other characters that first appear in this play, or they're the top few: indignity, overprized, footfall, sea change, footlicker, and ones that Shakespeare seems to have invented but occurred in earlier plays: amazement, incapable, unbacked, suppler. I do beseech that you are of suppler joints. I often feel that way. Follow them swiftly and hinder them from what their ecstasy may now provoke them to. And I'm going to talk, by the way, oops, keep doing that. Ecstasy, I'll mention this now because I think I'm going to skip over this later, does not mean sort of a drug-induced sexual ecstasy, meant madness at this time. So, and hinder them from whatever this madness may now provoke them to. And it gradually over time had a sort of narrower meaning of madness. Okay, but I'm going to skip over. False friends are words that we are familiar with today, but they have different meanings. And there's a lot of false friends. Look through these on your own, some that are particularly troublesome. I'm saying some of these false friends, it's sort of interesting. It's a word like hound, that in 1600 meant any dog, and today means a particular type of dog. Others like novice, any young man, now it has a particular meaning to it. And some meanings weaken over time, like nasty. Interesting that some words were neutral and then become much more negative over time. A villain was just any peasant who was locked to the land, and now a villain has something very different meaning. Vulgar was common, like vulgar Latin. The vulgar Bible was just the sort of common person's Bible. Awesome. Again, several slides just showing again, as I said, you could just review on your own if you're interested, of how some words back in 1600 had double meanings, had two different meanings, and sometimes there's a play on both of those. But in today, generally, one of them has died out largely. But you may see them like, let's say, glass. It really had two meanings, a mirror and then glass as we know it today, but we still talk about the looking glass, etc., or tempering iron. And more of those examples where they had two meanings today, but really now we only understand one. And so we can lose some of it. Okay, this is what I want to get to talk about this whole issue of translation and how would we handle this. So, Kit, I've been, without any announcement here, without any prep for you, but when I saw you on the bridge here, I'm offering you the option of reading this.
I'd be happy to.
Okay, great. This is Prospero talking to Ferdinand after Prospero suddenly stops the mask, which is this great visual performance of the three, is it 3 or 4 goddesses? And he stops it, and here's the speech.
You do look, son, in a moved sort, as if you were dismayed. Be cheerful, sir. Our revels now are ended. These our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherits shall dissolve. And like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Sir, I'm vexed. Bear with my weakness, my brain is troubled. Be not disturbed with my infirmity. If you be pleased, retire into my cell and there repose. A turn or two I'll walk to still my beating mind.
Nice. Well, as I said, many people attribute this is the last play that Shakespeare wrote, and you can see the sort of the potency of this perhaps as he's writing and he knows he's ending out his career right now and is going to retire to Stratton on Avon. Interesting that there's a couple of into thin air, baseless, insubstantial. These were the first times these words were used. So these were New Year's words. And then an archaic, or rack. Well, I'm not actually sure if this is archaic. Maybe those who you are like Andy and Jim who are in the theater business, but it's stage equipment. So when he says, leave not a rack behind, he's saying, you know, we will all disappear without any of the paraphernalia of the theater here. And when you translate it, and I took this translation from the Modern Shakespeare Library, and I'm not dumping on this at all. I actually like it in many ways. I'll mention this in a minute, more about it. But here's the translation. We are all made of the stuff of dreams, and our life stretches between the sleep before birth to the sleep after death. Sir, I'm upset. Please put up with this weakness of mine. My old brain is troubled, but don't be disturbed by it. If you would like to, you can go to my cell and relax. I'll take a little walk and calm my restless mind. So he's trying to, the translation is trying to make sense of this. But I think we might all agree that a lot of poetry's lost here.
Yeah.
Now, as I said, I'm not dissing on. In fact, I recommend this book because they do the original with the translation right after each speech, as well as the entire original, as well as the entire translation. It's a Modern Shakespeare library. So you don't have to read the translation. You can read the original, or you can read all the translation, or you can hop back and forth between the two. But this is the problem with translation, in my feeling, is they do too much. Rather than just trying to clarify the archaic or the false friends, they try to do everything. And why not just leaves as dreams are made on and our little life is rounded with sleep instead of the sleep before birth and the sleep after death? I'm going to skip this one because we have a better one. Okay. Are you ready, Jim? I want to emphasize here, I did not want to tell Jim anything here because I knew, being the professional that he is, he would be practicing and working on this and reviewing it because it's been a while, right?
Which I will make manifest that I have not.
And this way you had no, pressure to do any prep. Okay.
So this is Prospero when the play really has ended. All the action of the play has ended, and he sort of ushered all the characters off stage. And here the line between the actor playing Prospero and the character Prospero is very murky. So he says, "Now my charms are all o'erthrown, and what strength I have's mine own, which is most faint. Now 'tis true I must be here confined by you or sent to Naples. Let me not, since I've my dukedom got and pardoned the deceiver, dwell in this bare island by your spell. But release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free."
I don't know how you memorized all those lines. I still don't.
Well, of course, a central irony of the acting gig is you have to be able to forget your lines, by which we mean you have to know your lines so well and so automatically that you can actually play the scene. And
yes.
If you're reaching for a line, you can't possibly play the action of the character, which, Joel, I wanted to mention, it's sort of interesting, this issue of language, because I find that when you're watching Shakespeare, a lot of times you can be borne on by words here and there and by the action of the actors. Sometimes you sort of bog down and you say, what's going on here? But mostly you don't. And I think that that's the job of the actor, right? Acting is doing. So if the actors are doing their action and are projecting and working with the other characters, you get a very strong sense of what's going on, even if words go by you.
Right.
It's a little bit like watching a mime show. As long as you're understanding most of what the mime is doing, you're okay. But if you lose the thread of it, you're lost. But I think a lot of Shakespeare, particularly a lot of the comic stuff that Andy was showing us, is really borne along by the actions and by the emotions of the actors.
Oh yes, somebody once said famously, and I should know who it was, that Shakespeare's clowns are never funny. So because a lot of the humor got lost in the translation across the centuries, but they can be funny if you get the right people to do them.
Right.
Well, that scene of Caliban and Trinculo and Stefano, there was no amplification, and I'm sure the theaters were not silent. Right. And so this whole thing about there are two beasts under this cloak and what's going on here, the physical humor was obvious to the audience, even if they were missing half the words.
Yeah, good point.
I'm sure they hammed up the punchlines.
Right. Yeah.
They were not subtle, I'm sure.
They say, I read somewhere, that they loved the laughter. They loved the feedback Shakespeare did. They loved hearing that. And you both, Jim and Andy, spoke eloquently for the notion that you got to see it. And when you see it, the strength, the expertise, the experience, the genius of the actors really bring it all to life. And that's sort of the one position. And I have in the last slides here some of the other views about, are we in our generation, 400 years, losing that ability to appreciate and understand Shakespeare? Will it only get worse? I got the feeling in, let's say, the 1800s, 1900s, you studied Shakespeare. So it wasn't only the language, but you also spent time with it, and people understood it. So here's one, Folger Shakespeare language, sort of stating that same position. Those who have studied Latin or even French or German, and those who are used to reading poetry will have little difficulty understanding. But I think my feeling is when someone like the Folger or David Crystal here say, oh, it's not that hard, you won't have any trouble. it will make some of us feel like, what's wrong with me? I must be the only one here who's having a little trouble. Everybody else must understand it. And I think we have to be honest that it is a little difficult. We may miss some of it. We have to pay attention what the actors are doing and how they're trying to bring this language to life. Or frankly, I find Shakespeare very difficult to read. Personally, I know other people love reading it, but I keep going back and forth with the notations and all that.
You know, Joel, I want to break in. It has always seemed to me, and I have absolutely there's no evidence of this. I'm just making this up, but it's been my impression that the British have an easier time with this than the Americans. And I think it's just they're that much closer to him and to the source, and we are just that. There is that schism and that division, and two cultures, two people separated by a common language.
Right.
And I don't know, maybe it's just a bias. I see the British, and of course there are many brilliant American and especially Canadian actors who can play Shakespeare, but it just seems to me the British, it's almost like an instinct. It's something they get with their mother's milk. I don't know.
Well, I wondered if they get more Shakespeare in grade school, middle schools than we do. Does anybody know?
I don't know.
Yeah, they're just like I had some of those, the air and the hence and the thou and the thee, which are just, if you read a couple of plays or you've come across it in your schooling, you just get familiar with them. Anon, what does anon mean? And if you haven't, it's like anon, I have no idea what that means. So you're just lost at that point. Or, if you are able to go with the flow. Okay. I said, I like Paula Blank. I have several of these books. I think at the end, but here's a counter argument. This is John Mcwhorter, who's a well-known linguist, professional linguist, written many, many books at Columbia, I think he is now, or he might've moved. That says, I'm a professional linguist and I have trouble with it. And my friends have trouble with it. And he was supporting, I think this particular quote was, he was supporting the Oregon Shakespeare Project, which was commissioned a bunch of poets and playwrights to translate Shakespeare. I have not seen what's come out of it. I think it's sort of stalled the whole effort, but some .com millionaire was funding this all. So here in the last slide, I leave this to you. Some of those reasons that you should modernize Shakespeare and some of the reasons you shouldn't. But I think one of the main issues is if you did try to modernize it, besides just orthography, spelling, how do you do that? When do you stop? Is it just those few archaic words and leave the poetry and all that alone? I think that's a really tough question. But
it is a tough question. Joel, I saw a production a couple of years ago by the Actors Shakespeare Project, which they had modernized the language of Macbeth. And the woman who did it took a very, very light touch. I think all she did was...
I did see the same one, yes.
You did. You saw that with Nail Nacer as Macbeth. Yes. Yeah. And so a lot of the poetry was intact. The verse was intact. She didn't mess with the pentameter or anything. I think just a few of the archaicisms, she may have straightened out some of the inverted syntax, but I thought it was a very tastefully done approach.
Right. And Natalie, I know you were there, and Lori was there, and at times we said, has this changed at all? I mean, I'm not that familiar with Macbeth. And it was a very light touch. Good way to say it.
Yeah, it was very subtle.
Yeah. And we were all apprehensive, expecting it to be murdered, besides the characters. But and it was a light touch. So, is there any way to just do it so we don't get bogged down? And there's a couple of cases, I think, where it is really problematic, and it's just a speech, so it's hard to act it out. I had some of those in there, but I think it really could. One of the famous cases is talking to Goneril in King Lear, and he says, "I doubt what you say." And it seems like, why is he doubting? But doubt meant fear. So he's saying, I fear what you say. I fear what you say is true about another character. But so, you know, just one word could just send you off on a different path to say, why is he doubting what she's saying? Or another in Romeo and Juliet, where he says, I saw so-and-so making love to your daughter. Well, making love to your daughter today has a very precise meaning. And at that time it was courting. So it really changes the sense of that scene if he's saying to the father, I saw somebody making love to your daughter, versus I saw somebody courting your daughter. So it's that sort of thing that really could send you down the wrong, what they call the garden path. I think that is worrisome, and maybe just fixing a few of those could possibly increase people's appreciation.
Oh, question, Joel?
Yeah.
This Macbeth you saw, I'm just curious without getting into too much detail, was it, who rewrote it? I mean, it's, it sounds like it was a good idea and well done, but
Yes.
was it the director or was it a new?
It was a woman whose name I forget. I believe they may have commissioned her to do it. I think quite
she
remember.
comes from the Oregon. She was part of the Oregon project.
Ah, okay.
So probably a professional poet, writer.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, she was.
Yep. And that's right. And it was, you know, I think it was wisely done, I guess. I mean, I think in a way, I'm glad they hired poet, playwrights, etc. It's almost like you need a linguist in a way too, to say this is what this word meant, or this is how it was commonly used at that time, or this was a connotation of it.
Joel, I wanted to just say two things. One is, you know, a lot of productions of Shakespeare are sort of high concept productions where there's a specific setting or a kind of a period that's done, or Peter Hall once did years ago in the 70s a circus version of A Midsummer Night's Dream to try to communicate the spirit of the play. And sometimes they're a disaster, but I think a lot of times, and sometimes a director is just trying to show off or thinks that needs to be done in some new way. But when it works, I think it gives the audience an orientation that actually helps. The ART did a production of Othello this past season, and it was a naval motif. Othello was a naval officer.
Right, I saw that. Yeah. Which
of course he's, you know, he is a military officer in Shakespeare, but it gets you thinking and it gets you oriented in a specific way. The other thing I wanted to say was that we have in the chat room some former English teachers going back and forth, and I'm a former English teacher myself, and you spoke about the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. On YouTube, there is a lesson for students that's out. You can Google. Her name is Kirsten Giroux. Kirsten, Kirsten, Giroux, Giroux. And she grew up in Natick actually, but she's doing a lesson on Hamlet for kids. And I was responding to some of the things that were being said, that you have to take it down to a bite-sized piece. You know, to draw kids into Shakespeare, you have to look at 8 lines, 13 lines, 20 lines, and make everybody slow down and go through them.
Right.
And that's a luxury, you know, in the era of MCAS, we don't have that often.
Right.
I also think that years ago, and I'm sure I'm the oldest person on the call, years and years ago, there was a sort of canon, right? You were supposed to be taught certain things and learn certain things. You were supposed to learn Lucy, you were supposed to learn a major scale, right? That's one of the things you were supposed to learn, do, re, mi. And you were supposed to know something about Shakespeare. And, you know, there were these topics that you were supposed to know something about. And there is no canon anymore because there's so much knowledge, you can't possibly get your arms around it. So, I mean, the bad style of education was pouring all that content into your ear, but it did have an impact. You know, Lynn's grandfather, who had a high school education, could recite Shakespeare.
Right.
You know, he learned it in school. He knew how to read it, and he could recite some of it.
Yeah.
No college education whatsoever.
Yep. That's an excellent point. I think that at one point, everybody, educated person had seen The Tempest. and could refer to it and had studied it. And it was John Adams wrote essays about various Shakespeare plays, as did a lot of others. Has anybody heard, witnessed, seen, attended a performance of Shakespeare in original pronunciation?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Who said yes?
Yes.
What did you think of that?
Shakespeare, as the text is written?
No, as the pronunciation. The pronunciation was at 1600. That's a new movement away. Ben Crystal's been doing this. There's a theater in London apparently that does Shakespeare in the original pronunciation, which has changed a lot. But we only hear it in modern English.
How do they know?
Yeah, I don't understand how they can know.
Yeah, well, let's say they do it a lot on they build this up. Linguists smarter than I know how this all evolved, how vowel signs evolved. But they'll see that Shakespeare regularly, let's say, rhymes move with love, for example. And move and love don't rhyme in modern English, but it was move and louvre. Louvre, I guess love was pronounced differently at the time. You should listen. If you Google Ben Crystal, as spelt like the crystal, he has a number. He's really terrific. And he's with a theater in London, and there's little excerpts on YouTube of Shakespeare in original pronunciation. And it's interesting.
Angie made a comment that a lot of times the text is not bowdlerized, but it is cut. And I think even a professional company is going to cut huge, depending on the length of the play. The Tempest is short,
right?
But depending on the length of the play, there will be significant cuts. And of course, most famously in Laurence Olivier's film of Hamlet, which won the Academy Award, where he completely eliminated Rosencrantz and Guildenstern.
Yeah.
They don't appear. Like you're waiting, you're 2/3 of the way through the play, and you say, "Well, where are they? You know, are they showing up at some point?" And they never do. And that's just a decision to bring the show, to make the show tighter and not have it be as long.
Well, Helen Mirren, which I recommend, her Shakespeare that she did playing Prospero, they eliminated most of Act 4, which is the mask. They just eliminated the whole thing. But yet, you know, it's interesting. It's all done sort of original language. They didn't change anything archaic in that. They just eliminated a whole act.
I think in Shakespeare practice, there are what are known as the standard cuts. That if you're doing a production, if you're community theater doing Hamlet, there's a whole history of, well, this scene is almost never done. This is never done. And you can know what to take out to get it down to a manageable length. Because Hamlet, which Kenneth Branagh did at full length, runs about 4 hours.
Yeah. Jim, you mentioned bowdlerizing. Want to define that? And I was wondering, as I was going through the Tempest, in the bowdlerized versions, I guess it was a guy named Boulder, something like that.
Thomas Bowdler.
Is that it? Did they remove the whole?
Bodler.
Bodler?
Bowdler?
Bawlder.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did he remove the whole scene about Stefano and Caliban and Trinculo? I don't
know what he did, but he made his name, he became an eponym because of what he did to Shakespeare.
Yeah.
In the 19th century, there were interpolations into Shakespeare that became famous all by themselves that weren't Shakespeare. And there's a famous one in Richard III, but I don't remember exactly what it is. I think it's Conscience Avant, Richard's himself again, which was an interpolation that Shakespeare hadn't written, but which became common practice in the 19th century, and everybody thought it was Shakespeare.
Well, I'd love to know if this is true, but I read, you know, King Lear, 3 sisters all die at everybody's dead on the floor, pretty much, including the King Lear. And it's sort of depressing that it was rewritten with a happy ending, with Cordelia lives, she becomes a king of England with the King of France. And that was the only production performed until 1850, I was told.
Yeah.
One with a happy ending.
For hundreds of years, a good 100 years at least.
You know, that's rewriting.
And I think at one point Romeo and Juliet didn't die either.
Yes, that's right, Angie.
Yeah, so that's,
I'm so glad.
Yeah. I'm glad we don't do
I
that anymore.
lived.
It's sort of nice to at least have that, or, you know, not so prevalent anymore of doing it.
But then how could the wedding feast be turned into funeral meats if they don't die?
Yeah, right. Well, you cut that line.
Well, you got that line.
Well, and you mentioned Hamlet. Hamlet is long. And also, you know, I understand there's some controversy about, because the quartos are different than the folios, and or I guess 4 folios, and they could be, sometimes they were varied from one to another. So, you know, which was the right line? There's one where in the fact that Tempest, Miranda is really sort of attacking Caliban, saying, you know, you're a schmuck, you tried to rape me, all that. And some people are so convinced that that speech was so out of line with Miranda's personality that it was really supposed to be Prospero who said that particular passage. It's in Act 1, if you look it up. So in some texts, they have that whole passage attributed to Prospero and not Miranda. That's sort of a shame, because Miranda doesn't have much to say. So when you did it, did they give it to you or did they give it to Miranda, Jim?
Oh, definitely Miranda.
Miranda, okay. Yeah, that's what the versions I had give that speech to Miranda. But it does seem like, boy, you know, here's this sweet little girl and she's got a tongue in her head, you know, and it's pretty much the only time. She's a pretty flat character in my mind. So is Ferdinand. You know, it's like, oh, love at first sight, and they don't really have much meat except for that one scene. By the way, you're mentioning about different ways and different performances of how they can bring new light to your understanding. I've heard, I have not seen this, there was a Tempest performance where the entire cast of characters is all in Prospero's head. It's all figments of his imagination. And so he speaks every character's lines in the entire play, because he's making the point that the whole Tempest is in his own mind. Alonzo, you know, he's sitting in an insane asylum someplace maybe, and he's envisioning this all. That's an interesting take on the play.
Or perhaps he was just in quarantine.
Yeah. This is, by the way, the Tempest. They say there was in 1610, there was a shipwreck in the Bermudas, and the survivor wrote this long account. He was probably caught in a hurricane, the way it sounds, and they were on this island, the Bermudas. They reconstructed a ship, and they finally sailed to Jamestown. And it was a very popular read throughout England in 1610 or so. And some people say this inspired Shakespeare for this theme, because most of his plays are based on some other story. And The Tempest is one of which they don't have any previously existing story in any other culture, any other language that he seems to, it seems to be, may I say, out of thin air that he created this particular story. Is that, Andy and Jim, is that what you've heard about The Tempest?
Well, I heard the story about the shipwreck, but also, yeah, and that account of from the Bahamas and all that, and there was recent discoveries of the in and of the New World and such. So, I mean, that would be the basis. But I think everything else, of course, he made up. I don't know about any particular coup in Naples or anything like that.
Yeah, I've heard the same story. It's a Jamaican. There was a ship there, and it was a popular story.
Right.
Yeah.
And they say Shakespeare almost certainly would have come across this particular story. So it was on people's minds at the time.
You know, Joel, he got a lot of his stories from the Italians.
Yes.
Just to put in a plug for the paternal heritage.
And people say, you know, one of the evidence is that Shakespeare didn't write the plays, but somebody else did, the Earl of Oxford or somebody. Is like, Shakespeare never went to Italy, and he didn't speak Italian. How come he got all these stories from, you know, Venice, I heard, appears more often than any other city outside of London in his plays, or England or something like that. It's just a lot of Italian.
And Romeo and Juliet's in Verona.
Verona, yeah.
Right.
Okay, well, we've gone on for an extra, well, it was, as I said, scheduled to 8:45, but I think it's quite a long time to be on a Zoom call here. So I think it's an interesting question. I leave it up for your thoughts. You know, when you go to see Shakespeare, you know, thinking about what does it mean to enjoy this play, to understand this play, and is there anything that could be done in addition to what the actors do in the language itself, given how the language has changed? I don't have any firm opinion about this, but I've been wondering about this for 40 years.
Joel,
Okay.
where can we see your slides?
Oh, I thought they were sent out already.
Yeah,
Oh,
there.
They
I
were.
sent a link in an email. Oh, you can't hear
Okay.
me.
Yep.
Thank
Please.
you, Joel. That was fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
Courtney.
you, Joel, and
Thanks,
thank you,
Joel.
Thank you.
Courtney.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mcwhorter.
Bye.
Yes.
See you all anon.
Bye-bye.
Anon.
Anon.
I have no idea what that means.
Later.
You know.
Later.
Later, dude.
Later.
Yeah,
dude.
gotcha.